Alright, welcome back to Honored Madman. We've got another bite-sized video for you today. This time we're going to be talking about the Drang Knights. So from their armor description in Dark Souls 3, we know that they're from a land, or supposedly from a land, that's known for the legend of the linking of the fire, and that the armor was both strong and light because it had been reinforced by a rare mineral known as J-steel, or gay steel. You get the idea. The land they come from is obviously Drang, even if the name has sort of gotten obscured over the eons. Now it's just known as Drang. But Drang was the setting of Dark Souls 2, and in that game this set also appeared, but it was known as the Llewellyn set. It was worn only by Chancellor Villager, and it was actually really hard to obtain in the base game. Now in Scholar of the First Sin he just gives it to you, which is pretty cool. But in that game the description of the armor tells us that very few of these sets were ever made, probably due to the rarity of the materials involved in its creation, and the fact that by the events of Dark Souls 2, the inventor of this armor is nowhere to be found. We actually know very little about Master Blacksmith Llewellyn, only that he came from Mira to come to Drang to serve Vendrick, and that he was perhaps the only one skilled enough to work with this rare J-steel. Which, yeah, is probably why more of these sets didn't get made. I mean, maybe Llewellyn showed up late in the game, but I think it's more that the steel that makes it is in short supply, and only the most high-ranking knights and lords should be allowed to wear this exclusive armor. So we can assume that by the events of Dark Souls 3, these Drang Knights we encounter, the mercenaries, are in fact the descendants of high-ranking members of King Vendrick's royal court from the days of Dark Souls 2. And that after Drang fell for good, they sort of became a band of roaming mercenaries. And they were feared for their aggressive, no-shield, dual-wielding techniques using paired weapons, which is sort of an obvious nod to power stancing in Dark Souls 2, where if you had the right stats and you were dual-wielding, you could hold Y and go into a power stance to gain access to a new moveset, one that incorporated both the weapons with each swing. Pretty cool stuff. I imagine most of you already know that, though, if you're watching a video about Dark Souls 2 lore, but still. So the Drang mercenaries were extremely successful and feared mercenaries all across the Dark Souls universe. But then they found themselves serving a lord where treason meant having to traverse the abyss, and the Drang Knights found themselves separated forever. Now, it's hard to say exactly what this means with the open nature of these interpretations, but I think maybe they served Wolnir when they were still one whole mercenary company. Like during that era of Karthus where Wolnir was raging against the Abyss. It's also worth noting that there was at least one Mad Warrior / Prowler that resided in Karthus. You know those guys that look like the Predator in Dark Souls 2? Well, there's unfortunately no set of armor of theirs in Dark Souls 3, but you can find their weapon. Now it's been slightly renamed. It's no longer the Berserker Blade, now it's just the Black Blade Katana, but they have the same description basically. But the Mad Warrior was supposedly an eccentric that Vendrick invited into his court during the times where he was trying to find new ways to stave off the curse, and while most of them were charlatans and fakes, some of them were actually true masters of the, the arts. Presumably the Mad Warrior he invited was one of the true masters. So it wouldn't be too much of a stretch to assume that the Drang Knights as a mercenary company found their way to Karthus, as they already had ties with the Mad Warriors, or at least one Mad Warrior, and we know one Mad Warrior happened to live in Karthus. I know that's a stretch, like a super stretch, and maybe them being ordered to traverse the Abyss was perhaps when they served under Nishandra. And maybe this is a reference to the people who deserted when they found out Nishandra's true nature. They saw the writing on the walls, or Vendrick's hidden clues that he left behind, and they presumably fled Drang and had descendants in distant lands who became the Drang Knights. Either story is possible. Now that I think about it, that one seems a little bit more likely, but who knows? I personally think that it's a little bit more fun of a story that they served Wolnir for a time until it was fully consumed by the Abyss, and a few of these guys jumped ship and became wandering mercenaries, just kind of by themselves or as a group of three, and they basically did their own thing for a pretty long period of time, I'd imagine, until Pontiff came across them. And he was apparently so impressed by these guys that he's positioned them after his own boss fight to guard Aldrich. I mean, just think of everything you have to go through before you get to those Drang Knights. I mean, they're positioned right there like some elite fucking soldiers. And on top of that, they're annoyingly backed up by those deacons on the whole balcony thing. Their armor descriptions quote about them being from a land that's known for the linking of the fire is likely just a reference to the fact that they originated in Dark Souls 2, but I think the description probably should have read, from a land that's known for its war with the giants. Because Drang famously went to war against the giants because Nashandra manipulated Vendrick into thinking that they had something he needed, which they did, but he laid absolute waste upon the giants' home country while he was doing it, or at least enough for the giants to retaliate with an invasion of their own into Drang, a war that we mostly just see the aftermath of in Dark Souls 2, but can actually experience a few key battles through using the Ashen Mist Heart to gain access to the memories of the giants who died and became trees. You know, like the one outside the Firelink Shrine in Dark Souls 3. But yeah, the war was brutal, both of the countries got wrecked in the process, and then the Curse of the Undead followed soon after. So yeah, not a happy tale. But it appears the Drang Knights of Dark Souls 3 have inherited their ancestors' dislike or maybe absolute hatred of giants. And that extends to the Anor Londo giants as well, because holy shit, the courtyard is full of dead ones. And yeah, I know 2 of them are alive, but this was probably the work of those 2 Drang Knights. I mean, they're known, or at least their people are known for hating the giants, and I don't think it'd be a coincidence that they're surrounded by dead ones. In fact, there's also some evidence that there was a Drang Knight who was stationed at the Cathedral of the Deep who decided to take it upon himself to euthanize one of the church's giant slaves, only to get eaten and shit out and have his valuables looted by us, the player. It's probably worth noting that the Drang Knight's ancestors that fled Drang probably shared stories of the war with giants with their offspring as the generations went on. And by that point, I don't think there was any more of these stone or earthen giants left. They had probably all become trees by now. So I imagine when the Drang Knights saw the Anor Londo giants, they figured, oh, these must have been the giants that my grandpa told me about that he fought against and destroyed his kingdom. You know, thinking that the 2 giants were one and the same, even though that they're 2 completely different types of giant. But yeah, these extremely skilled sellswords in the employ of Pontiff Sullivan are presumably the descendants of Vendrick's royal court, and possibly how Pontiff got that portrait of Nashandra. But yeah, these guys' whole character seems to just be a straight up reference to Dark Souls 2, which I love. I mean, it's my favorite in the series, and I really like that they became known for their dual-wielding prowess and aggressive fighting style because, you know, yeah, you have to play Dark Souls 2 carefully, but you do want to end fights fast. You kind of do have to play aggressively sometimes. It's also worth mentioning that Llewellyn did also craft a shield that sort of went with this set, but it was a gift that he brought from his homeland of Mira to Drang, and it's currently in the possession of Horus the Hushed in Dark Souls 3, and I imagine he just got it when he stole that Executioner's armor, having left the Executioner's blade behind and grabbing this shield instead. And I mean, since he escaped the Cathedral of the Deep when he was a kid, maybe he stole it from one of the Drang Knights. But yeah, I don't want this video to go on too long. I have a few other references I wanted to do, but I'll probably just save that for like a whole video of Dark Souls 2 references in Dark Souls 3, and then like explain the lore implications of them. You guys know my format, I think it's called. Anyway, though, let's have our outro and then some final thoughts. I like to think the sellsword starting class was also one of the Drang mercenaries, but that maybe he got his armor damaged or he lost it at some point before we started playing as him. Obviously that's just a headcanon sort of thing, but it seems to, you know, it makes sense they both use paired weapons referred to as sellswords. I know that doesn't narrow it down or anything. But as always, if you guys liked the video, please like it. If you disliked it, please dislike it. And if you like hearing me ramble on about various lore topics from the Souls games, possibly the Elder Scrolls games, and at some point Fallout games, then please consider subscribing because I got a lot of stuff planned. The next one might be about the Corvians, it might be about Carla, it might be about the Forlorn. I'm not exactly sure yet which one I'm going to finish first, but stay tuned and we'll all find out together. As always, have a good one, and I'll see you next time.